We are pleased that members of the Baltic diaspora, as well as residents of the Baltic states, are among those joining us for today's program. We are fortunate to host two Washington, D.C.-based experts, Michael Kimmage and Karl Altau. They will address a question that is of ongoing concern to citizens of the Baltic states and their diaspora supporters, namely the nexus between the 3-year-long war being waged against Ukraine by Russia and its implications for Baltic security. To follow is a brief introduction of each of our speakers. Michael Kimmage is a professor of history at the Catholic University of America. From 2014 to 2017, he served on the Secretary's policy planning staff at the U.S. Department of State, where he held the Russia-Ukraine portfolio. He has been a fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and at the German Marshall Fund. He publishes widely on international affairs and on U.S. policy toward Russia. His latest book, Collisions: The War in Ukraine and the Origins of the New Global Instability, was published by Oxford University Press in March 2024. Michael's presentation will focus on Ukraine's current status, its prospects for peace and security, and the implications for the Baltic states. With the Joint Baltic American National Committee, JBANC, since 1997, Managing Director Karl Altau has helped conduct extensive advocacy on behalf of the Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian central organizations in the United States. This includes the period of NATO accession for the 3 Baltic countries and the campaign for Magnitsky sanctions against human rights violators in Russia. He has addressed the Baltic parliaments and the United States Congress on the work of the Baltic American communities. In his presentation, Karl will assess Baltic American efforts to influence Capitol Hill and the U.S. administration, explaining the current political landscape and suggesting concrete actions that we can take to support Baltic security. Michael Kimmage will speak first. Before I turn over the microphone to him, I wish to note that he and Karl will speak for 30 minutes each. We have set aside about 20 minutes following the presentations for Q&A. I ask that you send me questions using the chat function during either speaker's presentation and as the Q&A commences. In turn, I will read the questions aloud at the appropriate time. Michael, the podium is yours.
Victor, thank you so much for the kind introduction. Victor and I, of course, are colleagues, were and are colleagues at Catholic University. Victor, I get the impression, very comfortably retired, and myself still in active duty, but it's wonderful to be cooperating again, and it's an honor and a privilege to address this group. I want to provide a brief outline of my remarks. I'll make 3 points. And at the end of my third point, I'll touch on the question of advocacy and how either U.S. citizens or Canadian citizens, wherever you may be, can make the case. I think it's a somewhat different story in the U.S. at the moment than it is in Canada, how they can make the case or how you can make the case for the best possible approach to Baltic security. And I think with that, I can provide hopefully a good segue to Karl's comments about the political dimension to some of these difficult security questions. So the problem or the challenge of Baltic security, the security of the 3 Baltic republics, is, I would say, not an easy problem, but a difficult problem. And it's a difficult problem, I think, for one particular reason. It's not difficult to establish which country is the threat or the potential enemy of the Baltic republics. That, of course, is Russia, and there really is no other country that occupies anywhere near the threatening role that Russia potentially does. But it is very difficult, I find, to get the right sense of proportion. On the one hand, none of the Baltic republics would benefit at the moment from being completely militarized, mobilized on a sort of wartime footing. That, I think, doesn't correspond to the facts. At the same time, we wouldn't be having this conversation if there weren't a lot of concern about implications of the war in Ukraine and Russia's highly aggressive posture, if there weren't a lot of concern about what that means for the Baltic Republic. So it is possible to underestimate the threat, and in that sense to be ill-prepared for what may come, but it's also possible to overestimate the threat and to overshoot and in some ways to end up in a kind of panic or hysteria about the problem, which just isn't politically or analytically helpful. So I'll do my best by weaving back and forth, sort of some good news, some bad news from the war in Ukraine for the Baltic republics, and in doing so, we'll try to get the proportion as right as I can. But of course, we can return to that question when we have the chance for some more open discussion. So my first point is going to be about Russian motivations in the region, and trying through that point to convey with precision what the true threat is that Russia poses to the Baltic republics. Secondly, I want to return to the question of the war in Ukraine, give a brief update about where that is at the moment, and what progress, Ukraine's progress, or in some cases lack of progress in the war means for the Baltic republics. And thirdly, this is how I'll be able to pass the baton to Karl to say some words about the transatlantic relationship, which has been in a state of ferment since the inauguration of President Trump's second Trump term. And there are some quite considerable significant changes. And that, of course, is of essential significance to the security of the Baltic republics. So to start first with the question of Russian motivations, to think of the question, I'll try to do this from the Russian point of view, how Russia looks at the region. There are a triangle of assets that Russia has that sort of frame the question of the Baltic republics. There's St. Petersburg to the east, and there's Kaliningrad to the west. Kaliningrad, former German city of Königsberg, as I'm sure all of you know, and that is an odd thing. It's a kind of island of Russia within the world of NATO, and is also a Baltic seaport. So you have the port city of St. Petersburg, port city of Kaliningrad, and it is also the case, this wasn't fully true 5 years ago, but is now that Belarus is a Russian colony, and the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 was staged from Belarus as it was from other destinations. And so not only is Belarus completely in line with Russian military structures and postures, it has been in very recent history a place that Russia has used for territorial conquest and invasion. I think if you look at the map and think geographically about where the Baltic republics fit in Russian security doctrine or Russia's national security outlook, the problem on the Russian side is primarily a naval one. That it's the Baltic Sea, sort of Russia's access to the maritime world through the Baltic Sea, and that probably is the primary consideration for military and strategic planners in Russia when they look at the region. And secondarily, I'm not by any means expert on the topic, but I'll just raise it because I know it's important, which missiles are staged where. And of course, we could fit in Poland, and what we need to do to get a larger sense of the geometry or the geography of the region is to emphasize that Sweden and Finland joined the NATO alliance not long after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And so it is a very extensive set of NATO holdings in the region. Sort of Russia is there a little bit on its back foot. And I think, again, the kind of naval question for Russia is paramount. I extrapolate from this, and I think we could argue this point a lot because I know that there's a lot of expert disagreement on this topic. I extrapolate from this point that the problem is primarily a naval problem for Russia, that the territorial ambitions that Russia has for the region may exist. You can hear them on Russian television. There are lots of nationalist hotheads who speak about conquering the Baltic republics. But I think that this is, for the foreseeable future, a remote possibility. Let me put the point as simply as I can. I don't think that Russia at the moment has territorial ambitions in the Baltic republics. You would want to ask the question not just whether Russia could invade, and of course we all know, this audience in particular, the long history of Russian imperialism, Soviet imperialism in the region, but you do need to ask the question, what benefit does it give to Russia? And if you have the port city of Kaliningrad there already on the Baltic Sea, I'm not sure what value it is to additionally have the port of Riga. And when you think of the costs that invasion would entail, they would be quite significant, almost astronomical for Russia to invade the three Baltic republics or to invade one of the three Baltic republics. So here, in terms of my effort to get the proportions right, I will make the claim. I'll try to defend it if you don't agree with it, and would love to have the debate and discussion that the issue at the moment is not territorial ambition on Russia's part. On the other hand, it is, of course, clear that Russia does pose threats to the region, is a hostile power, and regards the Baltic republics as hostile powers vis-a-vis Russia. So I think there are two ways in which Russia will try to menace the Baltic republics, already is menacing the Baltic republics, and will try in the future to menace the Baltic republics. And one is to impose costs on the Baltic republics for supporting Ukraine. The Baltic republics proportionally are some of the biggest supporters of Ukraine. You just need to go through the statements of any head of state from Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and see a very, very fervent, high degree of support for Ukraine, high level of criticism for Russia. Arms are flowing from the Baltic republics into Ukraine, and within NATO, the Baltic republics are vigorous voices for support and defense of Ukraine. That, of course, is completely unacceptable in Russia, and there have to be, from the Russian perspective, costs imposed for doing that. What those costs are, it's often a little bit difficult to say, but I'll conclude on this point from my first set of observations about Russian motivations, that the so-called hybrid, non-conventional threats are really where we should focus our attention. It's not that we need to take off the table the possibility of a conventional territorial invasion. That's definitely something that we all have to think about in the US and Canada, in the Baltic republics and throughout Europe. But I would focus most energy and most resources on the question of how to defend the Baltic republics against unconventional threats, which could be cyber attacks, which could be, as has already happened, cutting of cables in the Baltic Sea, and the very substantial tools and mechanisms Russia could have, especially in Latvia and Estonia, to create the conditions of instability, to exploit, how does one call them, ethnic Russian, Russian-speaking, pro-Russian populations in these countries for Russia's purposes, which would be to, to sort of erode the stability and functionality of these countries. I don't think that Russia really has the power to destabilize these countries. I'll, sort of go out on a limb and say that it's just not within Russia's capacity. Russia would be happy to, but it's not really able to destabilize, but it will try. And it will look for moments of difficulty, challenge, sensitivity. I think we all kind of remember long before the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, there was a statue, I think it was in Estonia, of a, sort of Soviet military statue that was taken down, and a whole campaign on media and in local regional politics for the Russians to kind of push against the government of Estonia in that case. Obviously, espionage, lots of tools that Russia has for unconventional or non-conventional threats. I think at the moment, and for the foreseeable future, and I'll develop this point when I speak, as I will in a second, about the war in Ukraine, I think for the moment, the unconventional threats are really paramount. Let me turn now to the war in Ukraine to develop this point as to why the unconventional threats are the most significant ones. And they really do, I think this point really corresponds to the shape and nature of the war in Ukraine over the last 3 years. Let me start with what I think the bad news is, and then proceed to the good news, if you can really speak of that in terms of the war in Ukraine. It's such a terrible, senseless, awful war. It's hard to say that any aspect of it is good, but there is a distinction one can draw between negative significance for the region and in context positive significance. So the bad news of the war in Ukraine is that neither Russia nor Ukraine is going to win this war. It's 3 years in. For Ukraine to win the war in objective terms against a nuclear power that has some of Russia's military capacities is exceptionally difficult. Russia will retain the capacity to wage war in Ukraine for a long time to come. And I suspect, under Putin at least, that Russia will use this capacity to perpetuate a very long war. And I just don't see anything, sanctions, international diplomacy, I think, is not going to get Russia to change course, and domestic politics in Russia has dissolved into the Putinist dictatorship. So unless there would be dramatic changes on the ground, I don't think Putin faces too much of a threat from his own population. So I think you have to factor in a long war from the Russian side, in which Russia is more or less undefeatable, although can experience setbacks. But it's also the case, this is not bad news, that Ukraine is not going to lose this war. It's not a war that Ukraine is going to lose. Russia is impossibly far from taking even the city of Kharkiv, which is 30, 40 miles from the Russian border. Of course, lobbing missiles and causing all kinds of mayhem is a Russian possibility, but to take and control these cities is very, very far from what Russia is currently able to do. So let's sum up in a kind of brutal way for Russia in terms of the war. Over the last 3 years, Russia has lost, estimates vary between 700,000, 800,000 deaths and casualties, huge amounts of money, huge amounts of military hardware, and Russia has gained control over the city of Mariupol. That's the one city that Russia has gained control over, which Russia has completely destroyed in the midst of the war, and to me is a very questionable strategic value. So Russia is putting huge amounts of effort into this war, and it really isn't getting very far. And I do think that Zelensky and Ukraine have demonstrated that even if they can't win this war objectively, completely, and by getting all the Russian soldiers off their territory, they are not going to be defeated. And that is extraordinarily significant news that you could not take for granted back in those terrible weeks at the beginning of the war in February and March of 2022. So not great news that Russia won't be defeated, but relatively good news, I would say, on the Ukrainian side. Second point that I want to make about the war, which I do think is quite good news for the Baltic republics, is a kind of technical point or a practical point. And this has to do with the extent of Russian military capacity damaged or destroyed in the war. And so we have images now of Russians pulling tanks, World War II tanks out of warehouses. There are stories, and I think they're credible, of Russians using donkeys at the front to transmit military hardware. We don't have good journalism on the Russian side of the war. It's kind of a black box in many ways. We know that there was the Prigozhin uprising, this kind of mutiny in the Russian military back in the first year of the war. But the bottom line, and I think that this is, I don't have access to Western intelligence, but you can kind of feel you can feel Western intelligence trickling out into the media. And there is a high level of awareness in the US government, other governments, about how much of Russia's military Russia has destroyed in this war. And this extends beyond just military hardware and extends beyond, quote unquote, mere loss of life on the Russian side. What Russia did in the first year of the war was to burn through its officer corps. And so many of the most gifted officers in the Russian military lost their lives because of the recklessness, the craziness of the invasion plan. And it will take, military experts estimate, about 10 years for Russia to reconstitute its conventional military power. That plays back immediately, or plays back directly, to the point I was trying to make at the beginning about Russia's territorial ambitions or designs on the Baltic republics. I didn't assess those ambitions to be very high. We can argue about that. But even if they were very high, those ambitions, you still need the capacity to mount that kind of invasion. And that is not what Russia has at the present moment. Russia has diminished its ability to act militarily in the region because of the way in which it has fought the war in Ukraine. And that is, in the scheme of things, good news. Let me add two final points on this ledger that balance each other out. One is that Russia has put its economy, unlike any of us, including, I think, the Baltic republics, Russia has put its economy on a wartime footing. Russia has mobilized its economy, not mobilized its society, but it's mobilized its economy. So roughly 8% of Russian GDP is now being spent on defense, 4.5% in the case of the United States, and much lower in most European countries as a proportion of GDP. And because Russia is a dictatorship, what Russia is doing is running factories 24 hours a day. And so Russia has taken a kind of very discombobulated oil, gas-driven economy. It's still an oil and gas-driven economy, but it has invested hugely, especially outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg, in military industrial production. And that means, and this is a very shameful fact, I would say, that Russia is outproducing, or was until recently outproducing, the collective West in terms of things like artillery shells and some kinds of ammunition. So even though Russia's economy is smaller than the economy of Italy, its wartime economy means that it's really producing enormously. And I think we've all followed in the news that Russia is getting drones from Iran, it's getting military equipment from China, and it's getting soldiers and huge amounts of ammunition from North Korea. So it's not just a question of the Russian economy. Russia has sort of configured itself globally in such a way as to import military hardware. And so this question of capacity is not great on the Russian part, but it's also not static. And Russia is increasing its capacity to cause harm in Ukraine, but still struggling, I would say, to project power in the region. Final point here, very, very significant in my view, is that you have a change in government in Germany, from the Social Democrats to the Christian Democrats, from Olaf Scholz to Friedrich Merz. And Germany seems to be committed, looks like 9/10 of the work has been done, to spending roughly $1 trillion on defense. And Germany just committed an additional $11 billion to Ukraine's war effort. Of that $1 trillion, a lot of that is going to go to the German military, and it's about German defense, or NATO defense, European defense, but it's, of course, because of Russia and because of Ukraine that Germany is making this move. So no longer is Germany standing still. It's not following Washington's lead any longer. It's less bashful, less shy than it used to be a couple of years ago. And Germany is going to emerge as one of Europe's biggest military producers and is going to be a major military force in its own right. I do not interpret this as in any sense negative, not bad for the Baltic republics. And, we just have to talk about the 5,000 German troops who are going to be stationed in Lithuania, which is not something that Lithuanians are upset about. They're welcoming these German troops with open arms because they see them as fellow Europeans dealing with the threat that Russia represents. And this, I think, is very good news. This means that the whole balance of military power is shifting in Europe, and it's shifting in a direction that does not favor Russian interests and very much favors the interests of the Baltic Republic. So that's not what I would have predicted 6 months ago, that Germany would emerge as such an important player, but it has. And once again, I think that this is extremely good news for the Baltic republics. But let me conclude with what is more ambiguous and maybe what's potentially more disturbing in terms of the security situation in the next couple of years. And this is the transatlantic relationship. And it's not that in this case I wish to editorialize about American politics or get too deeply involved in debates about what President Trump will do or won't do. I want to try to be as neutral as possible, but I think it's objectively the case the transatlantic relationship is deteriorating. You see a high level of tension between the United States and Europe. Some of this is about issues of trade and commerce. Of course, the news of the past couple of days is about tariffs and all of that. And President Trump has regularly spoken of a European Union that takes advantage of the United States. In many countries in Europe now, there's the sense that the US is not consulting, is sort of not working with its European partners and allies. We could go back to the speech that Vice President Vance made at the Munich Security Conference in early February of this year, which many Europeans interpreted as a kind of unfriendly gesture or a distancing gesture between Europe and the United States. Again, putting things as neutrally as possible because this point too can be exaggerated. I think what Europe is for the Trump team, it's not a negative thing. It's not that, barring, hard to predict circumstances vis-a-vis Canada or vis-a-vis Denmark/Greenland, I'll put that on the back burner. I don't think that there's going to be, sort of a lot of direct friction between Europe and the United States, and certainly not any kind of military friction, or most likely not military friction. But Europe is a secondary theater for the Trump administration. It is not the center of the world as it was for George Bush Sr., as it was for Bill Clinton, as it ended up being for Barack Obama. Okay, George W. Bush is a bit different, but still Europe remained very significant. And interestingly, in the first Trump administration, you have 2 new countries entering NATO. You have increases in defense spending vis-a-vis Europe for the first Trump administration, and you have the first Trump administration sending lethal military assistance, these Javelin anti-tank weapons to Ukraine. Somehow the mood or the spirit is different in the second Trump administration. Western Hemisphere matters more, and Asia matters more. Europe is just declining in stature and significance for the Trump team. And that, of course, is causing a reaction in Europe, which takes us back to the point about why Germany is going to spend $1 trillion in defense. It's as much about the United States as it is about Russia. Not about Germany going against the United States, but Germany feeling it can no longer rely on the United States. But that point is maybe good in terms of Germany stepping up, but it tells us something significant about the transatlantic relationship. 2 points, one, sort of general point, and one that's going to be my conclusion, which will take us to the subject of advocacy. And with that, I'll pass the baton to Karl. As it is difficult to gauge the exact proportional nature of the Russian threat to the Baltic republics, and it's possible to go too high or too low, it's also difficult to gauge all that is shifting in the transatlantic relationship. So there's less emphasis being placed on Europe by the Trump team. There's more commercial friction, and there's a lot in Washington at the present moment that European governments seem not to like about the course of American domestic politics and foreign policy. But again, it's important here too not to exaggerate. When Secretary of Defense Hegseth, at the very beginning of his tenure, went to Europe, this is, I think, first or second week of February, 7-8 weeks ago, roughly that, he said a lot of normal things about the NATO alliance. He said a lot of the things that you would expect from the Biden administration, before that from the Obama administration, and before that from the George W. Bush administration. In some ways, the pressure that's being put on Europeans from the White House is as much about preserving NATO as it is about getting countries like Germany to spend more and to do more on defense. I have not gotten the message that the US is not interested in NATO. I've not gotten the message that NATO itself is falling apart or deteriorating, although the dynamic is a bit different. You had a ministerial meeting this past week in Europe where secretaries of defense met to talk about, ministers of defense met to talk about NATO, and the United States wasn't present. The United States just didn't send anybody to the meeting. There's talk now that the United States doesn't want to have an American in the role of the supreme commander of NATO, which is odd because that's always been an American position going back to Dwight Eisenhower in the early 1950s, and that sort of signals a question mark about the NATO alliance. But still, I assume that the U.S. is fundamentally committed to NATO, and that the Article 5 commitment that is so important for the Baltic republics remains very much in effect. I don't read the Trump administration as undermining that, though it's not impossible that a year from now or 2 years from now we could be having a somewhat different discussion. So, I would be careful, and we would not want to go too far in saying that the transatlantic relationship is over or finished or no longer functions. That to me seems really exaggerated. But the final point I'll make is a little bit on the alarmist side, or I would want it to be half alarmist and half constructive. I think what the Trump administration needs to remember when it comes to European security in general and Baltic security in particular, what it needs to remember is that what the US has been good at since 1945, since the beginning of the Cold War, is deterrence. The US has been really good at deterring in the Cold War a Soviet attack, and since 1991, attacks on NATO member states. Now, we do have to recall that Ukraine is not a NATO member, so U.S. failed to deter Russia in Ukraine, but that's not a NATO problem. That's a different kind of problem. The U.S. has been really good, and NATO has been really good at deterring Russia. Deterring Russia is not just a question of how many troops are stationed in Europe, and it's not just a question of how many missiles or how much ammunition or how much artillery you have in Europe. It is not just a question of physical things and hardware. Deterrence is psychological. Deterrence is almost cultural, sort of political culture that enables deterrence. And what you want on our side of the equation, lumping together Canada, the US, Baltic republics, and NATO Europe, what we want on our side of the equation is a Russia that is too afraid to challenge or to contest any inch of NATO territory. And here I'm just not that impressed with what the Trump team has been doing so far. They need to do better on that sort of psychological component, the messaging, the signaling, and all of that. And that, I think, is where people like us come in to make the argument and to speak to, in the US case, maybe members of Congress or opinion leaders, thought leaders, wherever we can sort of get the points across that, and I would put it this way in the language of the Trump administration, that deterrence is an America first policy. Deterrence is the cheapest way of dealing with the Russia threat, because if you can prevent Russia from invading in the first place, then you don't have to deal with the costs and the risks of a broader war in Europe. In other words, if we can deter Russia and get Russia not to invade the Baltic republics, then we have the best possible path forward in terms of American interests, American expenses, et cetera. Deterrence is an America first policy in the language of the administration, vastly preferable to the alternatives. And so I think it's you don't have to. I don't think we all have to speak the language of the administration and sort of adopt its framework and adopt its tone, but it's sort of smart in some ways to appeal to the White House that is there. And I think that there's a way of doing so that's very much in the interest of the Baltic republics, that sort of right sizes the kind of threat that Russia poses, and that retains the constructive role of the United States in the region as a deterrent role. And to remember that that's about not repeating Russian talking points, not looking weak, not being confused, not keeping your disagreements too much out in the open. I think transatlantic disagreements can be done in private. They don't have to be litigated in public. And if we do all of that, I think we keep the deterrent power that is essential for American interests in the region, but no less essential for the maintenance of security in the Baltic Republic. So I'll conclude on that note, but very, very eager to hear what Karl has to say, and then very eager to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Michael. I think you've provided us with a fascinating perspective, and I see that we've already got a number of questions in the chat function for you coming up. So I too look forward to that, to those questions. And so you have also provided a great segue for Karl's presentation. So Karl, the Zoom platform is yours.
Thank you all. Thank you, Viktoras. And I wanted to say uh, thank you for the opportunity. You and your colleagues at Ateitis for having us today. It's a pleasure to be here together with Michael and I was taking lots of notes. So very interesting presentation. Thank you. And thank you for that opportunity for the segue as well, because I was thinking a lot about what you were saying and about that, this is a new Trump administration, but it's not all gloom and doom. There are signs. When we had our Baltic Advocacy Days, just a couple of weeks ago, the Baltic foreign ministers had been to Washington, D.C. and met with Secretary of State Rubio, who referred to the Baltics as the perfect allies. So we kind of took that and used that in the days we were up on the Hill too. That not to say that everything we should take for granted, that all is okay. We have to really work at it. And I think with that in mind, as well, we saw and we gauged the interest in seeing a record crowd of people coming to Washington for advocacy days and the Ukraine Action Summit, which happened a week after or last week. There certainly is a lot of uncertainty about the Trump administration's stance on European security. So I think that in a way helped prompt people to get up and join us, wanting to do more. We're a vehicle for helping to provide information about the Baltics and the U.S. Baltic relationship. And I said that our Baltic Advocacy Days were the largest that we've had in the 8 consecutive years we've had them. But the Ukraine Action Summit also was the largest since 2022, with over 600 participants, just amazing, from all 50 states for the first time, all 50 states. And there were 450 meetings on the Hill. We were happy to get about 70 meetings on the Hill, but definitely upward trends for both of our organizations. And I do tell people that if you round it up a little bit, there are about 1 million Baltic Americans, mostly Lithuanians. Obviously, most of you live in Chicago, but there are also 1 million 1 million Ukrainian Americans. So in that respect, our communities here in the U.S. are on a par, but certainly more existential issues and concerns, grave concerns for the Ukrainian community. That was sort of a preface, but I did want to say that I'm planning on speaking also perhaps in 3 different segments. I wanted to give a little bit of background about my organization, the Joint Baltic American National Committee, for those of you who aren't familiar, and then maybe talk more about our work with Congress and the Baltic caucuses. And then that leads to the Baltic Advocacy Days, and some concrete issues that we brought up and continue to be bringing up, and including our support for Ukraine. And then finally, just more maybe things that everybody can do to help. We know that there's been just immense support from the Baltic American communities for Ukraine over the past 3 years, especially. Although we do remind people that the invasion began in 2014, so 11 years ago already. But about J-Bank, as we call it, was formed almost 64 years ago. We were formed on April 27th, 1961, and brought together the 3 then national organizations of Baltic Americans, the Lithuanian American Council, Altis, which had already been formed just about the time of the First World War, and to other Estonian and Latvian organizations, which came together in the 1950s, but mostly made up from the diaspora, the displaced persons generation following the Second World War. And I've thought about it a bit, but just remembering what the 1950s was like, and as Baltic Americans were here, and certainly many new Lithuanians who had come from Lithuania at the time, that the countries had been overrun by the Soviets, terrible, very catastrophic war. Family split. My own family, half remained in Estonia, the other half fled to Sweden and on to the United States. So these were all fresh wounds and fresh impressions on all of us. The Captive Nations movement was getting started in the 1950s, and efforts to do more to bring attention to the plight of those in Central and Eastern Europe behind the Iron Curtain. So we remember the Kirsten Commission hearings in Congress in the early 1950s that drew a lot of attention to the Baltic countries and the Soviet occupation and the Soviet crimes that were perpetrated in the Baltics. So I think just it's in our DNA that we do not want to see that ever replicated ever again. So with J-Bank forming in the early 1960s, we devoted ourselves to just reminding people what about the Baltic countries and their plight, and not forgetting, but at the same time, thanks to the U.S. policy of non-recognition of the occupation of the Baltic countries, the so-called Wells Doctrine from 1940, the U.S. Still kept relations with the Baltic governments away, in exile, let's say, in essence, and Baltic flags remained present and flying at the State Department for all those years during the dark years. But the light flickered, the flame flickered all the time, which gave our communities hope that sometime in the future, who knows when, that freedom and independence would return. So through the 1980s or the 1970s and 80s, the Helsinki process had gotten underway, and a lot more attention on human rights and political prisoners and such. And then we saw later in the 80s that things began to fall into place. The Baltic peoples themselves spoke up and acted, and certainly we supported all of that in the United States. And we saw the Baltic Way of August 23rd, 1989, which was also the 50th anniversary of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which divided Europe between Stalin and Hitler. And we haven't forgotten those moments either, because we are forced to remember because of the battle over the historical narrative of the Baltic countries. So we have to remember. If we don't remember, who will? So once the countries became independent again in 1990, 1991, then the first matter in order was to have the Russian troops leave. They were still occupying the Baltic countries. So in 1993 and 1994 in Latvia and Estonia, the troops did leave. Then there was the security question. There was a security vacuum, and the Baltics and other, just about all other countries in Central and Eastern Europe wanted to join Western institutions, and that certainly became a primary goal. And when I came to Washington in 1997, it seems like ages ago, and it was, NATO enlargement was the primary MO for our communities. And I could speak for hours on that from kind of an insider's view, but it was a lot of hard work from all of our communities. We had supported and witnessed the prior round of enlargement with Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary getting into NATO. There was the accession vote in the U.S. Congress in 1998, and the discussion in Congress took weeks. There were a lot of tough questions about the cost, about the getting consensus within NATO that was seen as an issue. Because with increased members, there may be dissent. We see a little bit about that in NATO today. But after the successful vote, and it was 80-19 in the Senate, that I think a lot of the hard work was done in addressing the tough questions and paving the way for the Baltics to get into NATO. And I remember I had the real pleasure of being in the Senate gallery to witness the vote then, along with Senator Durbin's staff and August Gurečkas, who passed a few years ago, but who was an outstanding member of the Lithuanian American community. So I said that the tough questions were answered, paved the way for the Baltics. So when the vote on Baltic accession and for 4 other countries came up in May 2003, it was a little anticlimactic because there was no opposition. Officially, the vote was 96-0, and I think the other 4 would have voted also, or at least 2 or 3 of them would have voted in favor. So it was a case closed. But then the work also continued. The Baltics had all supported U.S. missions and NATO missions. The Iraq War and Afghanistan were just going on then, and there was support in the Bosnia missions before. But after 2004 and NATO accession, we worked a lot then on new missions, and a lot of that was just to make sure that the transatlantic relationship continued. We're still working on that to make U.S. Baltic relations strong, and I see lots of good signs about that continuing. Certainly in Congress, there are more I think supporters of the Baltics than ever before. When 20 years ago or so, when we were on the Hill, we were trying to explain the difference between the Balkans and the Baltics. But now with so many members and congressional delegations traveling to the Baltics and staff delegations too, the knowledge about the Baltic countries and interest and support for the Baltic countries is at an all-time high. So that's a really, really good thing. So we've deepened the relationship in many ways. I have to mention the state partnership programs, which are very important. Lithuania and Pennsylvania share ties like that. Since our office is in Rockville, Maryland, and we're in Maryland, Estonia and Maryland have a great relationship, which also includes 6 or 7 partner or sister cities too. So there's a very active civilian to civilian component there as well. And Latvia and Michigan too share a very active relationship. So with U.S. military, National Guard personnel going over for exercises and training and just all the time. So that's really key to having really U.S. boots on the ground, along with the regular rotations of troops, also as part of the enhanced forward presence in the 3 countries. And Michael had brought up the just wonderfully increasing and very important German relationship as the lead country in Lithuania, doubling their forces and building an infrastructure. So that's certainly very, very key there. And then Michael again mentioned the attacks against Estonia with the removal of the bronze soldier in 2007 and the cyber attacks that happened in Estonia. And I think we didn't really even talk about cyber then, but cyber is a daily issue, along with disinformation and gray zone tactics and unconventional warfare. So that has also is happening on a daily basis, and there's certainly more attention to that in Congress and with the administration after the Russian invasion of Georgia and the 2014 and 2022 attacks against Ukraine. It's a different ball game. We're at war. There is great concern about the Baltics. I have friends in Estonia. Even some, asked me, like, is it time to leave the country? And I said, no, you're doing well. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania are in NATO. There are the Article 5 guarantees. Finland and Sweden are NATO members. The Baltics and its NATO allies are taking a more active, very much needed active role in patrolling the Baltic Sea. For the first time, Estonians had boarded a Russian ghost ship transporting oil, supposedly, possibly doing more. And the Russians, and together with their allies, I think, are looking and probing and trying to create chaos and confusion, and there's a struggle to stay one step ahead. So that's a little bit of the background, and in the remaining time, I wanted to talk then and focus on Baltic American efforts to influence Congress and the administration, as it says in the title. Congress is supposed to listen to the U.S. voters, so we have this unique capability in the U.S. to call, write, walk into a congressional office and have a chat with members of Congress or their staff, and doors are open. A couple of doors you have to call ahead of time and or even call outside the door to be able to come in, but there's this access between constituents and our elected officials that is probably like nowhere else. Okay, it's a little more difficult with the administration, because the administration usually tends to have their own ideas and motivations about things. So, but we can work with Congress and work with our elected officials and the Friends of the Baltics to enact change, positive change. So there are now, I think, maybe a couple of slides that I wanted to show. So perhaps the first one, as we start talking about the Baltic Advocacy Days that we just had, and that's the one with the map. I mentioned that we've had our 8th Baltic Advocacy Days. This time we decided to have in person because of COVID. We had gotten away from that. We had had virtual only events, and then we tried hybrid last year, which I thought was very successful, where we had 3 days of virtual meetings and 2 days of in-person meetings. But we felt there's nothing better than being there in person and meeting with people in a group to talk about the issues. And so I know a lot of people couldn't make it, but that doesn't mean that our work stops. And we're planning actually now virtual advocacy events to tie in with some of the issues related to the advocacy days going forward. So if you're interested, please contact us, and or the Baltic American media. I'm sure you can read about it in Draugas and Draugas News and other online online portals too, to find out how you can be active. So for the Baltic Advocacy Days, you see sort of the map of this past one that we had. We had more participants. Well, online we 1 year we did have more participants, but in person this is the most by far. We had the usual states represented, as you can see, in the Northeast, the East Coast, the Midwest, and the West Coast. There are some gaps there. The map looked a little different last year. We had folks from Texas who participated, Tennessee, Florida, West Virginia, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Oregon, and I think maybe there was another one or two, Missouri possibly. So we need to continue to broaden that to have people in the states that aren't covered, because not all of the influential policymakers in Congress come from the states where we're from. They can be from states where we have fewer Baltic Americans. So it's always a challenge. But I've always found out that quality is just as important as quantity, and I think that the Baltics have a great reputation of being very qualitative in their approach. Certainly, the embassies in Washington D.C. Do an amazing job. The diplomats that come from the Baltic countries, they might as well have rented apartments in Washington, because all of the travel back and forth that they do, it's been very active. But again, we wanted to keep it simple and focus on the Baltic security initiative. And maybe if you could show the second slide with the legislative asks. We wanted to focus on just the core issue, and that's support for Baltic security assistance. So the Baltic Security Initiative is something which has been in the books for the past few sessions of Congress. The FY fiscal year 25 budget was just approved about a month ago. It was very late, and they all tend to be running late. But there was a slight bump in a sort of stagnant amount of funding that was allocated for the Baltic countries. It wasn't really what we were asking for or seeking, which is more in the line of 350 or 375 $1 million to support different projects and programs with U.S. support, but with Baltic input as well. The Baltic Security Act is the best thing going today for the Baltic countries. And again, I think that with our support in Congress, with the Baltic caucuses, and then particularly in the legislation that was just introduced by Senator Durbin from Illinois and his Baltic Freedom Caucus co-chairman Charles Grassley from Iowa, have introduced the Baltic Security Initiative Act, which now has 14 co-sponsors. All the information, if you want to know more and details and see the language, the best site out there is congress.gov. And if you put in the bill number, which is S1009, you can find the text. You can find what actions have been taken and who is supporting the bill. And we use that to thank those who have been supportive, and then try to find others who haven't yet signed on yet. And so when I'm looking at this bill, and this is a bill that supports the authorization of funding for the Baltic countries for the Baltic Security Initiative, we find that they're mostly Democrats who have co-sponsored the bill. We need more Republicans to do that. So we've been speaking with a lot of Republican offices. Not enough yet, but we need to continue doing that. If you come from a state that has Republican senators, certainly do reach out to them. I know we reached out to a few, both of the new Ohio senators and others, but and the Senate Baltic Freedom Caucus we look at the list of caucus members. There are 19 now, so 1/5 out of every. Actually, it's 20 because Senator Slotkin from Michigan has said she has joined. So 1/5 of every member of the Senate is a Baltic Caucus member. That's fantastic. But only 4 or 5 are caucus members. So we need to get the other caucus members on board. We need to get folks from the um, authorizing and the appropriations committees to sign, because this is the sort of bill that they look at, and foreign relations as well. And in coming action, and you just see there's just a one pager we provided for staff members about the particulars of the Baltic Security Initiative. And during Baltic Advocacy Days, we asked those members who aren't members of the Baltic Caucus to consider joining, both in the House and the Senate. And what we've been telling people is that we're hoping to see action in the House of Representatives coming up. And last year, the two co-chairs, Don Bacon from Nebraska, he's getting a lot of media attention now, so you've probably seen him on TV recently. And the new Democratic co-chair, Salud Carbajal from California, are in the process of putting together a letter for appropriators to ask for the um, allocation then of funding for the Baltic Security Initiative. And we hope to see that in the coming weeks as the appropriations process for the FY26 cycle gets into heavier action. So we want to see that letter. What we did last year was to go out to members of Congress and in the key committees to ask them to support a letter that the two co-chairs sent to the appropriation chairs. Were at the time Ken Calvert, who is the chairman, and Betty McCollum from Minnesota, to ask them to support this. And we got 33 people, 33 representatives to co-sign the letter, which is great. So when the letter comes out this year, we only had 3 days notice last year. We hope to have a little bit more advanced time and get more people to sign that. So that's sort of like immediate on our plans. And then I just wanted to close with a mention about support for Ukraine. Last year, it was all about supporting the Ukraine supplemental appropriation that we saw that was approved a couple or 3 times. It took a long time to get the last appropriation, or the support for the supplemental for Ukraine to go through last year. Finally, it happened, and this year there is probably not as rosy a picture. And I know with the Ukraine Action Summit going on that there was a lot of focus on other steps that can be taken with helping to recognize Russia's actions in Ukraine as genocide, supporting a Lend-Lease bill that would allow Ukraine material support to fight. Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick, who's a moderate Republican, like our caucus co-chair Don Bacon, Brian Fitzpatrick from Philadelphia, who has introduced recently a Sanctioning Russia Act, which is a bicameral and bipartisan bill. Bipartisanship is really the key here, because we do need to have Republicans and Democrats in lockstep to support and the Helsinki Commission too, and Congressman Joe Wilson from South Carolina have been very, very supportive of Ukraine bills, and we support all of those. There are, I think, a few links in the chat to places that you can go to support Baltic concerns, but also to support Ukraine. So one of those is the Baltic Call to Action Unit, which is developed by one of our parent organizations, the American Latvian Association. But again, it is bipartisan or tripartisan. So anybody's invited to join that. And by doing so, you can get information and background and sort of pre-populated letters 4 times a year to your members of Congress, to your 2 senators, and to your representative, and numbers to call into the White House to help with actions that we are supporting with other Baltic American organizations, Lithuanian American Community and the Baltic American Freedom League. We work very, very closely with, and then certainly there was a lot of action, as I mentioned, with the Ukraine Action Summit. So the American Coalition for Ukraine, we're a founding member of that. They put together the summit, which just concluded. There's a link to Razom and their advocacy, and also our partners, the Ukraine Congress Committee of America, which is also the older Ukraine organization. They do a lot of great work on the Hill. There's a link to the Ukraine Congress Committee site online, and you can ask to be included on their email list. There is also the last graphic I just want to have put up. Thank you. There was just something very immediate today, and that's the ongoing Russian terror bombing of Ukraine. Today on Palm Sunday, the bombing of Sumy in Ukraine. So you can see all of this. We support. We forward to our contacts online. We use social media. You can call your member of Congress. There's this phone number at the very bottom to do that. If you don't know your member of Congress, you can call the Capitol switchboard and ask to be connected to either of your 2 senators or your representative, and also to the White House. So this certainly calls for our concern and our actions. So just a useful tip there. So I think I'm winding down now. I could drone on for a long time, but I'm very interested in hearing all of your questions and what Michael has to say. So thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much, Karl, for your detailed review of not just J-Bank's activities over many decades, but also for the current initiatives that at least those of us who live in the United States can take immediately. And now we're going to have an opportunity for Michael and Karl to address your questions. We have about 20 minutes. I have a number of questions already in the queue. If you haven't posed a question to this point, I would invite you to submit one through chat. And without further ado, I'm going to start asking the questions in the order that we receive them. The first ones I think are mostly addressed to Michael. You mentioned unconventional threats to the Baltic countries. What would be the end point of those threats, Michael? Would there be an end point?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the question. I think the answer is no, there would not be an end point. I don't think that Russia believes it can persuade most people in the Baltic republics to think differently about Ukraine or about Russia. So it's not about persuasion. It's about exacting costs, and it's about punishing these countries for supporting Ukraine. And there is a larger European picture to be aware of here. I think what Russia wants to do is to very visibly exact costs for all countries that Russia perceives as hawkish in these issues. And so, of course, Britain, if you look at Russian media, is sort of enemy number 1. Scandinavian countries are in that category. Germany, in part because of the defense spending that I just mentioned. France is sort of in between. Those are all countries, including the Baltic countries, republics, and of course Poland, that are going to be the victims of cyber attacks, unconventional warfare, in part because there are lots of countries in Europe that do think differently about this. So you have Slovakia and Hungary are kind of pro-Russian countries. Within Europe, Italy is on the fence, and these countries are not going to be the victims of unconventional war. So you punish and reward by not doing anything in certain ways in hopes of scaring off the countries that you could potentially convince not to support Ukraine. And of course, if you look at Slovakia and Hungary, they go against the EU. They create problems. They're against EU membership for Ukraine. And it's not as if Russia can engineer that outcome, but it can try to encourage it. So to the degree that there is a kind of political pattern or a political strategy, it's sort of picking winners and losers in the larger European landscape.
Okay, thank you. Next question. What does Russia want to do in the Baltic Sea that it cannot do now?
That's, nothing, I think. I mean, of course, Sweden and Finland bring maybe certain NATO capabilities. This is beyond my area of expertise, but maybe they bring certain NATO capabilities in a kind of naval sense. Some people refer to now the Baltic Sea as a kind of NATO lake, which is not accurate, of course, because Russia is present there. But in terms of freedom of navigation or movement of naval assets, I don't think that there's too much that's impeding Russia. And most importantly, if we think about practicalities, and it's not the case that Putin is always such a practical man, but about practicalities, there's nothing that conquering Riga would give Russia that Russia doesn't already have with its kind of naval assets in the Baltic Sea. There's a later question about predicting Russia and maybe being too soft on Russia. And I agree, you want to be as careful as possible or sort of as concerned as possible, but it is significant in a way that in terms of naval power, Russia probably has, maybe it wants more, but probably has as much as it needs in the Baltic theater, which plays into our discussions and debates about whether Russia might make a formal move or a kind of big move against the Baltic republics. Maybe it's a modest piece of mitigating evidence in that respect.
The next one is a comment, but I'm going to make that into, I'm going to add a bit of a question after it. The comment is, regarding Kaliningrad, it does not belong to Russia. According to the armistice after World War II, the status of Kaliningrad was left for another day. So the question is, long term, what is the future of Kaliningrad? Michael or Karl, do you care to speculate about that?
Sure, happy to. No, I think that it's understood, even if, I mean, it's a very good point about the circumstances in 1945 and how this was looked on then, but it's, I think it's understood as a fait accompli for probably two big reasons. Just, inertia might be another one, but two big reasons. One is that Kaliningrad is unbelievably militarized. It really is it's a Russian military installation. So it's not just a random piece of territory. It's full of military assets and soldiers, and that's kind of daunting in its own right. But the other point is maybe more significant. I don't think Germany has any interest in bringing Königsberg back into some version of East Prussia or whatever was there before 1945. One of the conditions for Germany to operate in Europe, and it's a good condition respected by every post-Second World War German leader, is that Germany is not going to challenge the borders of Europe, and that would go for Silesia and Poland, or Sudetenland and in the Czech Republic, but certainly for Königsberg. So it's not a good analogy, I think, to the Baltic republics in 1945, where the U.S. and very big communities of diaspora and other people just felt that this is a completely illegitimate act, was not going to be recognized, and actively people were waiting for the day when this could return. I would put, just not that you're asking about it, but I would put Crimea in the category of the Baltic republics after 1945. This is not recognized. Even China doesn't recognize the annexation of Crimea, and I think that there's a really active hope that when circumstances are right, Crimea will be rightfully Ukrainian. Königsberg, I think, is kind of gone for as far as one can imagine.
Okay. Realistically, what can Russia hope to achieve in Ukraine at this point?
That's not an easy question. Not an easy question to answer. It goes back to some of the things Karl was saying, and makes the question of advocacy for all of us, I think, a very urgent and important one. One thing that Russia could achieve, or you might put that in quotation marks, is diminished U.S. support to Ukraine. It's not that Russia can achieve that. It's not that Russia can create that reality. That's up to American policymakers, American citizens. But if there's not going to be another supplemental, U.S. military support is going to start to dry up. We saw a 1-week period after the explosion in the Oval Office between President Trump and President Zelensky, where the U.S. didn't provide targeting and intelligence to Ukraine. And even that 1-week blip, in a sense, I mean, it was only a couple of days, changed the dynamic in terms of the Ukrainian presence in Russia, on Russian territory in Kursk, in ways that really allowed the Russians to push Ukrainians out of Kursk in the last couple of weeks. So that's really consequential. What the U.S. does or does not do is really, really important. And Russia's capacities would be certainly enhanced if the U.S. were not just to withdraw military support, direct military support, but not to provide targeting and intelligence. Two other points. One is that each winter is more and more difficult for Ukraine to survive. Russia has systematically attacked Ukraine's electrical grid, heating system. As you would know from people familiar with the Baltic republics, part of the world that gets very cold. Lots of people live on pensions where it's very hard to spend more than they spend on heating costs, and all of that is getting really difficult. So there's the mysterious question of when a country reaches a breaking point when it comes to a war. I don't think Ukraine is anywhere close, but there is that question. We don't want to be too sanguine about that question. We don't want to be too unworried about the question of when that breaking point could be reached. I don't think it's there at the moment, but another really difficult winter where are we going to be? 25, 26, and then it will be year 26, 27, assuming the war lasts that long. That's one of the ways in which Russia could start to make big battlefield gains if there would be a kind of crumbling of the political or social order in Ukraine. Again, I think that's kind of remote from the present moment, but not inconceivable. But the last point to make is, I think, the most important one, is that in the last year, Russia has achieved nothing of strategic consequence in Ukraine. Nothing. They have made incremental territorial gains. Russia, lost 100,000 lives. I'm speculating, but it's in that area, to take the city of Bakhmut, which before the war was, I think, 75,000 or 100,000 people, and it's not going to give them much in terms of this war. So Russia is losing huge numbers of soldiers for basically meaningless incremental territorial gains. So I think, barring a huge change in U.S. policy, barring a kind of internal collapse in Ukraine, Russia can't achieve much of consequence. It's a pointless war for Russia. It is a senseless war for Russia. And we just have to wait for that moment. It's going to be 5, 10, 15 years from now when a leader after Putin is willing and able to recognize that fact. And then we might be in a better place. But Russia has achieved remarkably little with this war, and each month seems to achieve less and less. That, for the foreseeable future, is the bottom line.
So I would interject a question of my own to Karl. Karl, based on what you're hearing from Michael, do you think that U.S. policymakers share Michael's assessments? Is that the perception on Capitol Hill as well? Or is there a divergence? In other words, do they think that Russia is really not achieving much strategically in Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think that there's still a large majority of members of Congress who do want to see Ukraine succeed. They do want to see Ukraine win, and we haven't lost hope yet. But the challenges are becoming more and more difficult for a variety of reasons, and one of those is finding continued support from the U.S. For additional security assets. I know one of the points about the government is here for the U.S. government is that Europe should be taking on more of a role in stepping in to support Ukraine, and I think as a Baltic American, we can point to the fact that we're doing more than our share as far as helping Ukraine, the GDP support for defense for the Baltic countries are all in the top 5 or 6 or so. So and direct support for Ukraine also. Along with Poland, along with the Nordic countries, the frontline countries have been very supportive. So that kind of gives us some optimism. But I know that in our own work, we have been going out to visit with moderate Republican offices to just make sure that we can hold the line with them. That they don't stop supporting Ukraine. So it's we'll have to see. The next election is still a ways away, so we have to calculate that into and putting members of Congress's feet to the fire.
Okay. Next question is not the difference between the first and second Trump administrations that the first one has strategic thinkers with institutional memory and now only sycophants without institutional understanding or strategic thinking capacity. Where is Michael Kimmage's optimism on the U.S. staying in NATO coming from?
Great question. I just wanted to very briefly comment on what Karl said a moment ago, that it could be that Russia's inability to make dramatic progress in the war, progress in its terms, is a bit of a political problem on our side, because at the beginning of the war, there were all these images of death and destruction. Of course, we just had, I think, 30 Ukrainian civilians killed today in the city of Sumy, which is on the front page of a number of papers. But still, I think this story has receded. And I think that there isn't in the US this kind of existential worry about Russia winning the war. And that sometimes makes the political case harder to make. It's sort of like the urgency of supporting Ukraine has, I think, diminished a bit in our political culture here on this side of the Atlantic. And that's a bit of a challenge. And Karl, perhaps we could talk about strategies to speak to policymakers or to speak to members of Congress when lots of other issues are crowding out the war in Ukraine. There is definitely a generational and personnel difference between Trump 1 and Trump 2. I'll agree with that point for the most part. You had Mattis and you had McMaster and you had John Allen in the first Trump term and Pompeo and Tillerson in the end. All had a pretty transatlantic perspective, and as you mentioned, kind of institutional memory of the Cold War, memory of the Second World War. I don't think that that's absent from somebody like Marco Rubio, but probably not that important for somebody like Secretary Hegseth. National Security Advisor, well, Waltz is a pretty conventional strategic thinker, and I think does have memory of previous conflicts, and I think understands what the stakes are. But there does seem to be a lot more reluctance in Trump too to challenge President Trump and some of his instincts and some of his judgments, and I think that is a cause for concern. I'm not sure if I meant to project exactly optimism about commitment to NATO. There is a lot of noise in the transatlantic relationship at the moment. Some of the assumptions that we would have had a few months ago are weaker now in terms of what the U.S. Is committed to, and Article 5 is something that we need to debate and discuss in those terms. All I'm saying is that I have not seen a systemic messaging campaign on the part of President Trump or anyone else to say that NATO no longer matters, not to make the kind of defense spending that's necessary for the sustenance of NATO. And in fact, although it's not usually news, that's what I meant to say about Hegseth going to Europe and saying we need to shore up NATO. I mean, he said it a dozen times, but it's not news because it's not all that interesting. Whereas if there's one little comment about how things are different, that gets jumped on in our news media as cracks in the transatlantic alliance. So I just want to balance that out a bit. And I think that there is, a kind of baseline commitment to NATO, maybe not out of sentiment. That's a difference from Biden to Trump. Biden was sentimentally attached to NATO, a sacred alliance, he would call it now and then. Trump is not sentimental about NATO, but I think he recognizes that a Europe that is orderly and at peace is better for American interests than a Europe that is at war and in some state of disarray. And a kind of unraveling Europe. And I think he does see NATO as a bulwark in that regard. And it's sort of there as part of the picture. But I wouldn't want to be too optimistic because President Trump can be all over the map. He changes, he's moody, he gets mad at particular leaders. If leader of Germany angers him, I could imagine Trump threatening some kind of action on NATO. Bottom line, I would say, last point that I'll make when it comes to Trump and NATO, and it's not, to me, very encouraging, but it's also not the end of the world, is that President Trump is transactional when it comes to NATO. He asked the question, what do we get in return? And so it is necessary now for countries that are part of the alliance to say, well, we're spending 3% of our GDP on defense, or 4%. We're doing this, we're doing that. We're helping you when it comes to questions of China or international trade. And that's a new basis. It's a kind of new orientation for the transatlantic relationship, more transactional than it was in the past, but there are lots of ways in which Europeans can can work with that and keep the United States interested. And very importantly for the discussion that we're having, the Baltic republics are not the target. Karl, correct me if I'm wrong here. They are not the target of irritation for the Trump administration, and Poland is not the target of irritation, and Sweden and Finland are also not the targets of irritation. It's more sort of France, Germany, Britain for reasons that are kind of unconnected to Russia and Ukraine. And I would interpret that cautiously, maybe not super optimistically, but cautiously as good news.
And Victor, can I jump in on that one?
Absolutely.
Oh, great. Yeah, that's true. A great point that was made. I think the Baltics are still kind of the darlings in Washington right now. I don't want to get too far ahead of it, but there is a lot of support on the Hill, and I think respect in the administration too for the Baltics and what they've done. And so that gives us a responsibility as a community to to do more and to project that. When we were visiting the office of a representative from Indiana last year, and we speak with staffers mostly about what's going on and our interest in Ukraine as well. There's really great support for that, and we hear our bosses, the members of Congress, they understand that, they get it deep down, because of different reasons and ideologies and politics and everything like that maybe they can't all dissent from kind of the core core approach to this. So that's working against us. And when an office says that, well, it's great that you're visiting us, we hear arguments, support for Ukraine, let's say, from a number of constituents every day, but they're pale in comparison to the calls that we get to stop supporting Ukraine and make America isolationist again. So we have to battle that. We have to be smarter. I mean, I mentioned before that for the Baltics, it's more quality than quantity, but we have to kind of figure out a way to get that quality too. I tell my Estonian compatriots that for every Estonian in the U.S., there are 80 Ukrainians. So we have to rely on our support networks, on not just ourselves and the Lithuanians, Estonians, and Latvians, but friends of the Baltics. So we have to get them on board. We have to support Ukraine as much as we can, and we have to be, get beyond the calls that are barraging Congress to not support Ukraine or the region. In essence, us too. And if I could just at this point shamelessly promote an event that we have next week on April the 16th on Wednesday evening. We've been having these Baltic spotlight discussions with experts from the Baltic countries or who know about the Baltics. And the next one is with a disinformation expert from Canada, Markus Kolga, who's been doing a lot of work on the area and working to sort of shine the light on sort of the factual world that we all need to live in, and to counter our arguments or discussion about things that aren't true. So that's really an important responsibility for all of us to recognize that, to speak up, to write letters to your local newspaper, and to make sure that the arguments that we have that we know are correct are the ones that prevail.
We are out of time, running out of time, and we do still have a few questions and comments, but I think we're going to have to leave it at that. I think it's a testament to your presentations, Michael and Karl, that they've elicited so much interest and a number of questions. So on behalf of everyone participating here, I want to thank you for sharing your insights with us on a topic that matters to us a great deal. You provided us with a lot of information, a lot of perceptive ideas about not just the situation that exists now, but about what we can do moving forward to check the Russian regime's expansionism. I also want to thank the members of the virtual program Programming Committee for making this presentation possible. We look forward to seeing many of you at our next virtual program in the fall. For those of you who celebrate, I wish everyone a joyous Passover and Easter. Thank you for participating.